Preliminary assessment. The Aqua series presents itself as a cosmological compendium, a systematic account of the dimensional structure of experience, organized across 10 volumes and comprising taxonomy, visual encoding, cultural history, practical instruction, linguistics, natural history, and apophatic dissolution. The ambition is considerable. So is the execution. What follows is an attempt to evaluate the system on its own terms and then to press on it from outside those terms, identifying where it holds, where it strains, and what it reveals about the enterprise of systematic cosmological thinking itself. The series originated, as its own internal documentation acknowledges, through an iterative dialogue between human intuition and generative process, a list of names that began at 72, grew to 88, and accumulated properties, orderings, corrections, and elaborations through a process closer to discovery than design. This origin matters philosophically. The Aqua series is not a system deduced from first principles and then populated with examples. It is a system that emerged from the bottom up, acquiring theoretical structure retrospectively. This gives it an unusual epistemic character. The taxonomy follows the phenomena. The taxonomic achievement of Volume 1. Volume 1, the compendium of the 88 dimensions, is the system's necessary foundation and its most durable contribution. The fourfold measurement framework chrono-index, luminosity score, wave density, resonance quotient is the central intellectual achievement of the series. Its strength is that it generates genuine differentiation. No two of the 88 dimensions share identical profiles across all four axes, which means the framework is doing real classificatory work rather than merely distributing names across a grid. The choice of these four axes in particular merits scrutiny. Chrono-index temporal dynamics and luminosity score energetic brightness are relatively conventional. Most phenomenological systems include something like temporal quality and experiential intensity. Wave density, structural interconnection, and resonance quotient consciousness affecting capacity are more original. Wave density in particular captures something that most experiential taxonomies miss, the degree to which a state is internally differentiated and interconnected, which turns out to be as important as its energetic level in determining its phenomenological character. Diamond and Oracle both have high wave density. What distinguishes them is primarily chrono-index and luminosity. The framework earns this distinction. The resonance quotient is philosophically the most demanding axis. It measures something that sits awkwardly between subjective and objective, the capacity of a dimensional state to affect the consciousness encountering it. This is not the same as the intensity of the state that is closer to luminosity nor its structural complexity wave density. It is something like the state's claim on attention, its insistence on being felt. That Oracle and Paradox both score maximum resonance 10, while Everyday scores only 4 is a defensible claim. These are genuinely different in how fully they occupy the experiencing subject. But the measurement raises the question of whose experience sets the baseline. Resonance quotient, more than the other three axes, is implicitly indexed to a specific type of consciousness, the kind that finds Oracle demanding and Everyday recessive. Whether this indexing is a flaw or simply an honest acknowledgement that the system is built from human experience is a question the series does not fully resolve. The structural problem of 88. The number 88 is justified in Volume 5 through a combination of numerological resonance, the piano keyboard, the astronomical constellations, and the argument that the list achieved a kind of inherent rightness through iterative refinement. This is not a rigorous justification. It is, however, the right kind of justification for this kind of system. The serious question is not why 88 rather than 72 or 100, but whether the 88 dimensions are the right 88, whether they constitute a genuine partition of the experiential manifold or merely the particular sample that the generative process happened to produce. Here the system faces its most significant internal tension. Some dimensions are clearly distinct experiential states with well-established cultural and phenomenological precedents: silence, oracle, flux, labyrinth, jubilee. Others are more questionable. What exactly differentiates echo from echoes? Fine from finite. The G-series GAA, GAO, GI, GI, GOX, GOAUI are treated in Volume 8 as phonemic tokens exploring variations around a single consonant, which is an interesting linguistic observation, but it raises the question of whether they are genuinely distinct dimensions or one dimension approached from multiple phonemic angles. The system's response to this challenge is implicit rather than explicit. It treats the boundaries between dimensions as fuzzy by design, arguing most directly in Volume 2 that most experience is between dimensions rather than in them, and that the 88 named states are poles rather than categories. This is a reasonable response, but it means the system cannot be evaluated by the criterion of clean partition, which is precisely the criterion that the fourfold framework's precision seemed to invite. 3. The anti-dimensional framework. Volume 3, the Anti-Codex, is the system's most philosophically rigorous volume and its most underexplored. The core argument, that anti-dimensions are not absences or negations but structurally distinct inverted mechanisms, is correct and important. The distinction between anti-lumina as active luminosity extraction rather than simple darkness is a genuine conceptual contribution, and the contamination typology, 5 types from local depletion to cascade, provides a more nuanced account of negative experiential states than most phenomenological systems offer. The recursive problem, do anti-dimensions have anti-anti-dimensions, is handled with admirable honesty. The answer given, yes, and the regress is infinite, and the anti-anti-dimensions are not reducible to their positive originals, is philosophically correct. Negation is inexhaustible in precisely this way: the negation of the negation is not the original. Hegel demonstrated this, and the Aqua series independently recovers it. The acknowledgement that the system is therefore open in the direction of negation, that the 12 anti-dimensions are the first layer of shadow, not the complete shadow manifold, is one of the series' most honest moments. What the anti-codex does not adequately address is the selection criterion for the 12. The volume states that the chosen anti-dimensions are those whose positive functions are structurally enabling, those whose inversion would affect the manifold as a whole rather than only a single dimension. This is a coherent criterion. But it generates a selection that is weighted toward relational and luminous dimensions: beloved, harmony, lumina, jubilee, and underweighted toward dimensions of structure and constraint. Why not anti-diamond, or anti-labyrinth? Anti-labyrinth, the dimension in which all structures are simultaneously navigable, in which difficulty has been removed from the experiential manifold, would be philosophically interesting and arguably as consequential as anti-harmony. The current 12 feel selected by intuition more than by the stated criterion. IV. Volume 4 and the question of visual encoding. The Sigil Registry is the series' most formally original volume. The claim that sigils are not symbols, that they instantiate rather than represent, is drawn from genuine esoteric tradition and is philosophically defensible. The fully declarative generative grammar, every sigil derived algorithmically from the dimensions for properties, is an unusual commitment to transparency in a domain where opacity is typically claimed as a virtue. The resulting sigils are genuinely distinctive across the 88 dimensions, which is necessary for the system to work as claimed. The grammar is motivated, the connections between property values and visual elements, chrono-index driving line character, with density driving lattice complexity, resonance driving containing form, are semantically coherent. What remains unresolved is the claim that the sigils do more than represent, that they actually instantiate dimensional properties. This claim cannot be evaluated within the terms the series provides. It requires empirical testing that the series, by its nature, cannot conduct. The sigils are beautiful and internally consistent. Whether they are operative in the stronger sense the volume claims is a question that falls outside the critical analysis of the system and into the domain of practice. The Atlas is the series' most contestable volume. Volume 6, the Aqua Atlas, is where the system is most exposed to objection, and deliberately so. The mapping of historical civilizations to dimensional registers is not presented as scientific history, it is presented as dimensional hermeneutics, an interpretive lens rather than a causal account. This framing is necessary but also limiting. The readings are intellectually serious. The analysis of the Roman Empire as a nexus civilization collapsing under anti-aqua contamination, the progressive freezing of the connective tissue that made the empire function, is not merely poetic, it maps onto the actual historiographical debate about what Rome's collapse consisted in. The treatment of the Enlightenment as a clarity register generating its own blindness through the systematic elimination of mystery is a recognizable critique with distinguished intellectual precedents. Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment makes a structurally similar argument. The more problematic readings are those that reduce complex historical formations to single dominant registers. Tang Dynasty China as primarily spectrum harmony aqua is a persuasive characterization of the cosmopolitan High Tang but says little about the military crises, the economic pressures, or the Lushan rebellion's origins that the volume attributes to anti-harmony without fully explaining the mechanism. The dimensional framework is better at characterizing the quality of a civilization at its peak than at explaining the dynamics of its collapse. The two are related but distinct analytical tasks, and the Atlas sometimes conflates them. The individual figure readings in Part 3 are the Atlas's strongest section. The identification of Cleopatra as an aqua figure, defined by fluid adaptive responsiveness rather than by fixed identity, is genuinely illuminating and does not reduce to the obvious biographical notes. The reading of Harriet Tubman as Phoenix Aqua Devildog captures something about the specific combination of qualities that made her achievements possible in a way that conventional historical description often misses. These readings succeed because they are precise enough to be contested, which is the mark of interpretive claims doing real work. VI. The Practitioner's Manual and the Question of Operability. Volume 7 is where the system's theoretical commitments must become practical recommendations, and where the gap between the two becomes most visible. The practices described, invoking aqua through edge softening, invoking silence through the aqua waypoint, the anti-aqua banishment protocol, are coherent descriptions of real contemplative and psychological techniques. Aqua invocation maps onto the psychological practice of diffusion, loosening the grip of fixed cognitive and emotional states. Silence invocation maps onto mindfulness-based practices. The anti-silence banishment protocol maps onto attention restoration theory. The question is whether these mappings enhance or diminish the value of what the practices describe. The dimensional vocabulary adds something. It provides a unified framework within which disparate techniques can be understood as addressing the same underlying structure. The practitioner who understands that their meditation practice is accessing the silence register, that their creative work moves through aqua into flux and then requires cadence to produce anything, and that their cognitive rigidity is anti-aqua contamination, this practitioner has a more coherent map of their own interior life than one who treats these as disconnected activities. The emergency protocols are the manual's most practically valuable section. Protocol E2, Oblivion Proximity, is unusual among contemplative manuals in explicitly stating that this condition requires external assistance, that the navigational capacity required to exit oblivion proximity is among what oblivion has consumed. This is clinically accurate and rarely said with this clarity in systems that tend toward voluntarist assumptions about the practitioner's agency. 7. The Lexicon's contribution. Volume via the Lexicon of Dimensional Language is the series' most academically conventional volume and one of its most genuinely useful. The analysis of the four linguistic registers Semantic English, Greco-Latin Inheritance, Coined and Hybrid, Numerical and Formal provides a framework for understanding the system's own linguistic character that illuminates what it is doing and why. The treatment of the opaque tokens is the volume's intellectual peak. The argument that DOLUYZK, GOAE, GEEI and the G-series are not failures of naming but names at the honest frontier of language, technical terms for states that no community has previously needed to name, is the system's strongest linguistic claim. It draws on genuine philosophy of language, the source sure and arbitrary sign, Wittgenstein's private language, the technical vocabulary of specialist domains, and arrives at a defensible position. The opaque names are not mystification but an honest acknowledgement that certain regions of experience exceed existing semantic resources. The translation tables are genuinely illuminating. The observation that silence has no clear Indo-European cognates, that the root **Silia** stands isolated in the linguistic family, is a small but striking philological finding. The argument that zenith is the only dimensional name that traveled from Arabic into all European languages, making Arabic the original rather than a translation, corrects a likely common assumption. These are the kinds of observations that justify a dedicated philological volume. 8. The Bestiary's theoretical status. Volume 9, The Dimensional Bestiary, is the series' most philosophically bold volume and, correspondingly, its most epistemically exposed. The framing, that the beings described were observed rather than invented, is the claim that requires the most careful handling. The volume's defense is ecological rather than supernatural. Every environment implies inhabitants shaped by its conditions, and the dimensional manifold's environments are sufficiently varied to generate correspondingly varied forms of dimensional intelligence. This is a reasonable argument by analogy, but the analogy has limits. Biological ecology generates inhabitants through evolutionary processes operating over deep time, processes that are at least in principle mechanistically explicable. The mechanism by which dimensional environments generate inhabitants is not described. The volume proceeds as if the ecological analogy is sufficient to establish plausibility, but it is doing more philosophical work than the text acknowledges. The most credible entries in the bestiary are those where the being described is clearly a way of characterizing a quality of experience that practitioners report. The silence keeper, described as what makes the silent state feel inhabited rather than empty, what distinguishes genuinely inhabited silence from mere quiet, is a phenomenologically accurate description of something that meditators across traditions report. Whether this quality is a being in any meaningful sense, or whether being is a useful metaphor for a quality of dimensional experience, is a question the bestiary does not resolve and perhaps cannot. The retroactive identification of historical beings in the field notes section is the volume's most intellectually playful contribution and its most epistemically fragile. The reading of Daniel's angel as a beloved weaver encounter, of Pentecost as a Nova Herald event, these are typological readings in the classical theological sense, finding structural resonances across texts. They illuminate the dimensional categories by showing what they look like in historical description. They do not constitute evidence that the beings are real in any sense beyond the phenomenological. IX. Volume 10 and the Question of Apophasis. The Final Silence is formally the series' most important volume and strategically its most effective. The apophatic move, the systematic negation of every positive claim the series has made, is the correct terminal gesture for a system of this ambition. It acknowledges that the 88 dimensions, however precisely described, point towards something they cannot reach, that the measurement framework, however useful, does not capture what matters most, that the system, however complete, is not everything. The use of the Leibniz question, pourquoi il y a plutôt quelque chose que rien, as the question the series has been approaching across 10 volumes is rhetorically effective and philosophically apt. The Aqua series is, in one reading, an elaborate way of sitting with this question long enough and carefully enough that it can be fully felt. The answer it gives, that the question cannot be answered from within the manifold, that the series was never trying to answer it but to make it precise enough to be felt, is honest and, in its way, adequate to the question. The progressive dimming of the series table in Volume 10, each volume's title rendered at decreasing opacity until Volume 10 itself is nearly invisible, is the series' most successful single design choice. It performs what the text describes without requiring that the text describe it. Overall evaluation. The Aqua series is a serious and largely successful attempt to do something genuinely difficult, to build a systematic vocabulary for the full range of experiential states, grounded in specific properties, organized by consistent principles, and developed across multiple methodological registers. Most comparable projects either remain at the level of loose typology, Jung's psychological types, Maslow's hierarchy, or retreat into purely technical formalism that sacrifices phenomenological richness. The Aqua series does neither. Its central strengths are the fourfold measurement framework, genuinely differential, semantically motivated, the transit topology of Volume 2, operationally precise, the anti-dimensional contamination theory, more nuanced than most accounts of negative states, and the philological analysis of the opaque tokens, an original contribution to the question of what names can and cannot do. Its central weaknesses are the selection criteria for the 88 dimensions, not fully explicit, generates some redundancy, the ecological mechanism of the best theory, asserted rather than argued, and the atlas's tendency to over-reduce complex historical formations to single registers, better at peak characterization than at dynamic analysis. The series' deepest achievement is structural. It builds a system that is internally coherent across 10 volumes, aesthetically differentiated without being thematically inconsistent, and genuinely open at its terminal point rather than falsely closed. The instruction at the end of Volume 9, return now to Volume 1, it will not be the same book, is the series' final and most accurate claim. The reader who has traversed the full 10 volumes does return to Volume 1 in a different register. Whether that register is oracle or merely a heightened familiarity with the vocabulary depends on what the reader brought to the encounter and what they were willing to let the system change in them. That the system cannot determine this from inside itself is not a failure. It is the correct outcome. Critical analysis prepared in the standard register of academic philosophical review. No external sources were consulted, the analysis is internal to the system as presented across all 10 volumes. Asterisk.